A citywide blackout had swallowed our small town, plunging us into a darkness so profound that even the familiar streets felt alien. It was supposed to be a quick run to the store, but now I found myself stumbling through shadows, the weight of my breath heavy in the stagnant air. I wasn't alone. People, their faces masks of confusion and fear, emerged from their homes, their flashlights flickering like desperate fireflies. We were drawn together by an unspoken understanding that safety lay in numbers. Amidst the chaos, a beacon of hope emerged, the old stone church at the heart of town. I joined the growing crowd, a haphazard collection of strangers, all driven by the same primal instinct to survive. The church doors groaned open, and we spilled inside, grateful for the sanctuary it provided. The heavy wooden doors shut behind us with a finality that sent a shiver down my spine. Inside, the church was eerily quiet, the flickering candles casting long, wavering shadows on the stone walls. Father Donovan, the aging priest, greeted us with a solemn nod, his face etched with worry. We were safe, for now. We settled in the pews, the tension palpable. Whispers of reassurance mingled with murmurs of fear. I sat next to a young woman clutching a small child to her chest, her eyes wide and unblinking. Across from me, an elderly man clutched a rosary, his lips moving in silent prayer. The church, once a symbol of solace, now felt like a tomb. Father Donovan lit more candles, their dim glow barely penetrating the darkness. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the hall, and the candles flickered ominously. My heart leapt into my throat, and a collective gasp filled the room. "Stay calm," Father Donovan urged, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "It's just the wind." But we knew better. Something was out there, something that made the darkness feel alive with malevolence. I glanced around, meeting the eyes of others who shared my dread. We were trapped, our fragile sanctuary surrounded by an unseen terror. A distant scream pierced the silence, chilling us to the bone. My pulse quickened, and I saw the same realization dawn on every face around me. We weren't alone in this nightmare. Without warning, the doors burst open, and a figure stumbled in, covered in blood and breathing heavily. It was a young man, his eyes wide with terror. "They're coming," he gasped, collapsing to the floor. The church that had once felt like a refuge now seemed like a trap. Father Donovan tried to calm us, but his words were drowned out by the rising tide of fear. As the young man lay there, his life ebbing away, he whispered one final, chilling word that hung in the air like a death knell: vampires. The room fell deathly silent. We were trapped, surrounded by creatures of the night with no way to call for help. The flickering candles cast grotesque shadows on the walls, and I knew that the real horror was only just beginning. We had to band together, trust strangers in a way we'd never imagined, and fight for our lives. Because the night was far from over, and the vampires were coming. The air inside the church grew heavier as the last echo of the young man's warning faded. Father Donovan, his face ashen, motioned for two men to help move the young man's lifeless body to a pew. His eyes then met mine, filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "We need to fortify the church," he said, his voice steady but strained. "Close the shutters, block the doors. We can't let them get in." People scrambled to secure the entrances, using pews, tables, and anything else they could find to barricade the doors and windows. The sound of wood scraping against stone was harsh in the confined space, a stark contrast to the earlier silence. I helped where I could, my mind racing with the terrifying realization that we were fighting for our lives against creatures of the night. As we worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every shadow seemed to harbor unseen eyes, every creak and rustle a prelude to an imminent attack. The candles flickered madly, casting grotesque, shifting shapes on the walls. It felt like the church itself was breathing, alive with our collective fear. In the midst of our frantic preparations, a young boy, no older than 10, tugged at my sleeve. His eyes were wide, reflecting the flickering candlelight. "Mister," he whispered, "do you think they're really vampires?" I crouched down to his level, forcing a reassuring smile. "We don't know for sure," I said, my voice gentle. "But we're going to do everything we can to keep everyone safe, okay?" He nodded, his small hand slipping into mine. I squeezed it, feeling a surge of protective instinct. Whatever was out there, I wouldn't let it harm this child. Just as we finished securing the last window, a loud thud resonated through the church, followed by the sound of something heavy being dragged. Every head turned towards the main door, the source of the noise. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to listen. Father Donovan stepped forward, his face a mask of grim resolve. "Stay together," he instructed, his voice barely above a whisper. And stay quiet. The dragging sound grew louder, closer, accompanied by a low, guttural growl that sent chills down my spine. It stopped just outside the door, and for a moment, there was silence. Then, a deafening crash as something massive slammed against the barricade, causing it to shudder violently. Screams erupted, and chaos ensued. The barricade held, but it was clear that whatever was outside was determined to get in. The pounding continued, each impact more forceful than the last, shaking the very foundation of the church. "We need to hold it together," Father Donovan shouted over the din. "Stay calm." Suddenly, the pounding stopped, replaced by an eerie, unnatural silence. We held our breath, straining to hear any sign of movement. Minutes passed, each one stretching into an eternity. Then, from the darkness outside, a voice, smooth and mocking, called out, "You cannot hide forever. We will have you all." My blood ran cold. The voice was unlike anything I had ever heard, dripping with malevolence. It was as if the darkness itself had found a voice, and it was speaking directly to us. Father Donovan crossed himself, his lips moving in silent prayer. The rest of us exchanged fearful glances, realizing that our ordeal was far from over. The vampires were out there, and they were waiting. The night stretched ahead, a void filled with terror and uncertainty. We huddled together, knowing that we had no choice but to fight. The vampires were coming, and we had to survive. Because in the end, it was either us or them. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness, every creak and whisper amplifying our fear. Huddled in the church, we could do little but wait, the anticipation of another attack gnawing at our nerves. We had barricaded ourselves in, but the sense of safety was a thin veneer over a well of terror. I found myself talking to the young boy, Danny, whose wide eyes never seemed to blink. He clutched a small toy car, rolling it nervously between his fingers. I learned that his mother had been with him but had gotten separated in the chaos. My heart ached for him, and I promised myself I would keep him safe. Father Donovan moved among us, offering words of comfort and prayers. His presence was a fragile anchor in the storm of fear that threatened to overwhelm us. He led us into him, the familiar melody of brief respite from the oppressive tension. Just as we began to believe we might last the night, a sudden chill swept through the room. The candles flickered violently, casting twisted shadows on the walls. A sound, like nails scraping on a chalkboard, reverberated through the church. My skin crawled, and I felt a primal fear grip my heart. A woman's scream shattered the silence, followed by a sickening thud. I turned to see a figure, pale and gaunt, standing over a prone body. The vampire's eyes glowed with an unholy light, its mouth smeared with blood. Panic erupted anew, people scrambling to get away from the creature that had somehow breached our sanctuary. The vampire moved with terrifying speed, grabbing a man who tried to run. Blood sprayed as it tore into his throat, the gruesome sight searing into my mind. We were not prepared for this horror, the reality far worse than our nightmares. Father Donovan grabbed a large wooden cross, brandishing it at the vampire. "Back, demon," he shouted, his voice strong and unwavering. The vampire hissed, its eyes narrowing in anger, but it retreated, at least for the moment. "We need to get out of here," someone shouted. "We can't stay trapped like this." "But where can we go?" another voice argued. "Out there, it's even worse." As the arguments grew more heated, I spotted movement near the back of the church. A group of vampires, their eyes glowing with hunger, were forcing their way through a window we had missed. We were surrounded, and our flimsy defenses were failing. Danny tugged at my sleeve again, his eyes filled with tears. "Mister, I'm scared." I knelt down, trying to mask my own terror. "I know, Danny. But we have to be brave. We're going to get through this." Father Donovan called for quiet, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Listen to me. We cannot give in to fear. We must stand together, protect each other. God is with us." His words, while meant to comfort, felt like a fragile shield against the darkness closing in. The vampires outside were growing bolder, their taunting voices echoing in the night. They knew we were weak, that our hope was fading. A loud crash shook the church, and a section of the barricade gave way. More vampires poured in, their eyes gleaming with malice. We fought back with whatever we could find, candlesticks, crosses, even broken pieces of pews. It was a desperate, frantic struggle, the air thick with the smell of blood and fear. In the midst of the chaos, I saw Father Donovan grappling with a vampire, its claws raking his arm. With a final, desperate effort, he drove the wooden cross into its chest, and the creature shrieked, dissolving into ash. But the victory was short-lived, More vampires were coming, and we were running out of time. I grabbed Danny, pulling him close as we retreated to the altar, our last line of defense. "Stay with me," I whispered. "We'll make it. We have to." The night stretched on, a relentless nightmare with no end in sight. The vampires were relentless, and our strength was waning. But in the darkest moments, a spark of hope remained. We were not alone, we had each other. And as long as we stood together, we had a chance. Dawn was still hours away, and the church had become a battlefield. The vampires were relentless, their attacks growing bolder and more coordinated. We had fortified our position at the altar, but it felt like a losing battle. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood and the acrid stench of fear. Father Donovan was injured, his arm wrapped in a makeshift bandage. He refused to rest, insisting on leading us in prayer and fighting off the vampires with a fervor that bordered on desperation. His faith was our only anchor, a fragile hope against the overwhelming darkness. Suddenly, the main doors shuddered under another heavy blow. The barricade, weakened from the repeated assaults, groaned ominously. We knew it wouldn't hold much longer. I tightened my grip on Danny, who clung to me with wide, terrified eyes. "Get ready," Father Donovan warned, his voice strained. "They're coming through." With a deafening crash, the doors burst open, and a flood of vampires poured in, their eyes glowing with hunger. They moved with inhuman speed, their fangs bared in cruel anticipation. We fought back with everything we had, but it was a desperate, chaotic struggle. Amidst the chaos, I saw a vampire lunging toward Danny. Without thinking, I threw myself in front of him, feeling the vampire's claws rake across my back. Pain exploded through me, but I swung a broken piece of wood, catching the creature in the chest. It shrieked and disintegrated into ash. Danny was crying, his small body trembling. "I want my mom," he sobbed, his voice barely audible over the din. "We'll find her," I promised, my voice choked with pain. "We'll get out of here." But even as I spoke, I knew the odds were against us. The vampires were overwhelming our defenses, and our strength was waning. Father Donovan fought valiantly, his faith an unbreakable shield, but even he couldn't hold them off forever. In the midst of the battle, a sudden, chilling voice echoed through the church. "Stop!" The vampires froze, their eyes turning towards the entrance. A figure stepped through the doorway, tall and commanding. His presence exuded an aura of power and malevolence that made my blood run cold. He was their leader, and his very presence seemed to sap the hope from the room. "Enough," he said, his voice smooth and mocking. "This game has gone on long enough." Father Donovan stepped forward, his face pale but resolute. "Leave this place, creature of darkness. You are not welcome here." The vampire leader laughed, a sound that sent chills down my spine. "Oh, but we are very much welcome. This is our town now, our hunting ground. And you," he said, his eyes sweeping over us, "are our prey." Fear gripped me, and I tightened my hold on Danny. We were outnumbered, outmatched, and there was no escape. The vampire leader's eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a cold, paralyzing terror seep into my bones. "Fight if you must," he said, his voice a deadly whisper. "But know that by dawn, you will all be ours." The vampires closed in, their eyes gleaming with hunger. We were trapped, surrounded by an unstoppable force. The night stretched on, a relentless nightmare with no end in sight. And as the vampire leader's gaze bore into mine, I realized with a sickening certainty that our fight for survival had only just begun. Time seemed to blur as we faced the relentless onslaught. The church, once a place of sanctuary, was now a battlefield soaked in fear and blood. We fought with every ounce of strength we had left, but the vampires were unyielding. Their leader watched us with a detached amusement, his presence a constant reminder of our impending doom. Father Donovan, despite his injuries, continued to rally us. His voice was hoarse from shouting prayers and commands, but his spirit remained unbroken. "We will not give up," he yelled, raising the wooden cross high. "God is with us." The vampires hissed at the sight of the cross, recoiling slightly. It gave us a momentary reprieve, but we knew it wouldn't last. I glanced around at the others, their faces pale with exhaustion and terror. We couldn't hold out much longer. Just then, a loud crash echoed from the back of the church. We turned to see the stained glass window shatter, and more vampires poured in through the broken frame. My heart sank as the last vestiges of hope slipped away. We were surrounded on all sides, and escape seemed impossible. In the chaos, I spotted a small door near the altar, partially hidden behind a tapestry. It led to the church's basement, a place where we might find a temporary refuge. "This way," I shouted, grabbing Danny and pulling him towards the door. Others saw us and followed, a desperate rush towards a potential escape. Father Donovan covered our retreat, swinging his cross at the vampires with a fierce determination. "Go," he urged. "Get to safety." We scrambled through the door, slamming it shut behind us. The basement was dark and musty, the air thick with the scent of decay. I fumbled for a light switch, and a dim bulb flickered to life, casting eerie shadows on the stone walls. We huddled together, our breaths ragged with fear and exhaustion. "Is everyone here?" I asked, my voice trembling. A quick head count revealed that a few people were still missing, including Father Donovan. My heart ached at the thought of him facing the vampires alone, but there was no way to go back. We had to find a way out, or at least a way to survive until dawn. As we explored the basement, we found a hidden passageway, partially obscured by old crates and cobwebs. It seemed to lead to an underground tunnel, a possible escape route. "We have to take this chance," I said, my voice filled with resolve. "It's our only hope." The group hesitated, but the sound of the vampires pounding on the door above spurred them into action. We moved quickly, making our way through the narrow tunnel. The air was cold and damp, and the walls closed in around us, but we pressed on, driven by the primal urge to survive. Danny clung to my hand, his small fingers gripping mine tightly. "Will we make it?" he whispered, his voice filled with a child's innocent hope. I squeezed his hand, forcing a smile. "Yes, Danny. We'll make it. We just have to keep moving." As we ventured deeper into the tunnel, the sounds of the vampires faded, replaced by an eerie silence. The passage twisted and turned, a labyrinth of stone and darkness. My mind raced with questions. Where did this tunnel lead? And would it truly bring us to safety? Just as we began to feel a glimmer of hope, a chilling realization struck me. The tunnel wasn't empty. We weren't alone. I felt a cold, malevolent presence watching us, its eyes piercing through the darkness. "Keep moving," I urged the group, my voice barely above a whisper. "Don't look back." But it was too late. A scream echoed through the tunnel as one of our group was snatched away, disappearing into the shadows. Panic surged through us, and we broke into a run, the cold air biting at our heels. The tunnel seemed endless, but we pressed on, driven by sheer terror. And then, finally, we saw it, a faint light at the end of the passage. Salvation was within reach. We burst out into the open, gasping for breath. The tunnel had led us to a small clearing in the woods, the first light of dawn just beginning to break on the horizon. We had made it, but at a terrible cost. As we stood there, catching our breath, I knew the fight was far from over. The vampires would come for us again, and we had to be ready. But for now, we had survived the night. And that, in itself, was a victory. The clearing was eerily quiet, the only sound the labored breathing of our small group. We had escaped the church, but the reality of our situation was grim. The first light of dawn was breaking, casting long shadows through the trees, but the safety it promised felt fragile and temporary. "We need to keep moving," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. "We can't stay here." The others nodded, their faces pale with exhaustion and fear. Danny clung to my side, his small hand gripping mine with a desperate strength. I squeezed his hand, trying to offer some semblance of reassurance. "Where will we go?" a woman asked, her voice trembling. I glanced around, taking in the dense woods surrounding us. "We need to find shelter," I said. "Someplace where we can regroup and figure out our next move." Father Donovan had taught us to stay together, to protect each other, and that was the only plan I could think of. As we moved deeper into the forest, the morning light gradually chased away the shadows, but the sense of danger lingered. After what felt like hours of trudging through the woods, we stumbled upon an old, abandoned cabin. It was small and weathered, but it looked sturdy enough to offer us some protection. We approached cautiously, checking for any signs of danger before entering. The cabin was musty and filled with cobwebs, but it had a fireplace and a few pieces of old furniture. We quickly set to work securing the door and windows, using whatever we could find to create makeshift barricades. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. As we settled in, the exhaustion began to take its toll. We were all battered and bruised, both physically and emotionally. Danny curled up next to me, his eyes heavy with sleep. I held him close, my mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. "We need a plan," I said, addressing the group. "The vampires won't stop. They'll come for us again." We should try to reach the next town, a man suggested. They might have a way to call for help. I nodded. It's worth a shot. But we need to rest first, gather our strength. The hours passed in a tense, uneasy silence. We took turns keeping watch, eyes peeled for any signs of movement outside. The light of day brought a temporary reprieve, but we knew it wouldn't last. Night would fall again, and with it, the vampires. As the sun began to set, a sense of dread settled over us. We had to move quickly, to find a way to reach the next town before darkness enveloped us once more. We gathered what little supplies we had, preparing to leave the cabin. Just as we were about to head out, a faint noise caught my attention. It was a soft, almost imperceptible sound, like the rustling of leaves. My heart pounded as I strained to listen. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, eyes darting to the others. They nodded, fear etched on their faces. We stood in silence, the sound growing louder, closer. It was then that I saw them, figures emerging from the shadows, their eyes glowing with an unholy light. The vampires had found us. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Danny and bolting for the door. The others followed, panic propelling us forward. We tore through the woods, the sound of our pursuers growing ever closer. My lungs burned, my legs felt like they would give out at any moment, but I couldn't stop. Danny's safety was the only thing that mattered. We stumbled and fell, but we kept moving, driven by sheer terror. As we neared the edge of the woods, I spotted a faint glimmer of hope, a road. If we could just make it to the road, we might stand a chance. We burst through the tree line, gasping for breath, and saw headlights in the distance. A car. We waved frantically, hoping against hope that the driver would see us. The car slowed, then stopped. A man stepped out, his face a mask of confusion and concern. "Please, help us!" I shouted. "They're coming." The man didn't need to be told twice. He ushered us into the car, glancing nervously at the woods. As we sped away, I looked back and saw the vampires standing at the edge of the trees, their eyes burning with hatred. We had escaped, but the fight was far from over. We had to warn the next town, to find a way to stop the vampires before they claimed more lives. The night had been a nightmare, but it was only the beginning of our struggle for survival. As the car sped down the road, I held Danny close, praying for the strength to face whatever horrors lay ahead. The car ride was tense, filled with an unsettling silence. The man who had picked us up introduced himself as Tom, a local from the next town over. His eyes were wide with concern as he listened to our story, nodding solemnly. "There's an old police station a few miles up the road," Tom said. "It should have a working phone. We can call for help from there." We nodded in agreement, relief washing over us at the thought of finally reaching safety. Tom drove quickly but cautiously, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few seconds. The sun was setting rapidly, casting long shadows across the road. My heart pounded with each passing minute, knowing that nightfall would bring new dangers. Danny clung to me, his small body trembling with fear. After what felt like an eternity, we arrived at the police station. It was a small, run-down building, but it looked secure. Tom parked the car, and we hurried inside, locking the doors behind us. The station was deserted, a layer of dust coating the desks and equipment. Tom led us to the back, where an old rotary phone sat on a desk. He picked up the receiver and dialed, his hands shaking. Come on," he muttered, his voice filled with urgency. After a few tense moments, Tom spoke into the phone, explaining our situation. I could hear the faint voice on the other end, asking questions and assuring us that help was on the way. Relief washed over us, but it was short-lived. A loud crash echoed from the front of the station, followed by the sound of glass shattering. My heart leapt into my throat as I realized the vampires had followed us. "We need to barricade the doors," I said, grabbing Danny and moving towards the entrance. Quickly. We scrambled to move desks and chairs, creating a makeshift barrier. The sound of footsteps grew louder, closer, as the vampires closed in. I could see their eyes glowing in the dim light, filled with an insatiable hunger. "We can't hold them off forever," Tom said, his voice filled with desperation. Just as the vampires began to pound on the barricade, a loud siren blared outside. Red and blue lights flashed through the windows as a convoy of police cars and emergency vehicles pulled up to the station. The cavalry had arrived. The vampires hesitated, their eyes narrowing in anger. They knew they were outmatched, at least for the moment. With a final, frustrated hiss, they retreated into the darkness. Relief washed over us as the police and paramedics entered the station, assessing our injuries and taking statements. We were safe, for now. Danny was taken to the hospital for a checkup, and I stayed by his side, my heart heavy with the weight of the night's events. The police assured us that they would do everything in their power to stop the vampires, but I couldn't shake the feeling that our fight was far from over. As the night stretched on, I found myself unable to sleep. The image of the vampire leader's eyes, filled with malevolence, haunted my thoughts. I knew he wouldn't give up so easily. He would come for us again, and we had to be ready. The next morning, as the sun rose over the horizon, I made a vow to myself. I would do whatever it took to protect Danny and to stop the vampires once and for all. Our fight wasn't over, but we had survived another night. And that, in itself, was a victory. The days following our harrowing escape were a blur of police interviews, medical checkups, and sleepless nights. Despite the assurances of the authorities, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that hung over us. The vampires were out there, and I knew they would come for us again. Danny and I were placed in a safe house, along with Tom and a few others who had survived. It was a small, nondescript house on the outskirts of town, guarded day and night by police officers. We were told it was the safest place for us, but I couldn't help but feel like a caged animal, waiting for the inevitable attack. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the safe house, there was a knock at the door. My heart skipped a beat, and I glanced at the police officer stationed at the entrance. He nodded reassuringly and opened the door. A tall, imposing figure stood on the threshold. It was Father Donovan. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollowed from the trauma of the previous nights, but there was a determined glint in his gaze. He had survived, and he had come to help. "We don't have much time," he said, his voice urgent. "The vampires are coming. We need to prepare." We quickly gathered in the living room, listening intently as Father Donovan laid out his plan. He had spent the last few days researching, trying to find a way to stop the vampires once and for all. He believed that if we could find the vampire leader's lair and destroy him, the others would be weakened and easier to defeat. "It's risky," Tom said, his brow furrowed. "But it's our best shot." We spent the rest of the evening preparing. Father Donovan blessed water, turned wooden furniture into makeshift stakes, and instructed us on how to fight. As night fell, a sense of grim determination settled over us. We were ready to take the fight to the vampires. Under the cover of darkness, we made our way to the outskirts of town, where Father Donovan believed the vampire leader's lair was located. It was an old, abandoned mansion, its windows dark and foreboding. We approached cautiously, our hearts pounding in our chests. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of decay. We moved silently through the hallways, our makeshift weapons at the ready. The mansion was a labyrinth of rooms and corridors, each one more ominous than the last. Suddenly, a figure appeared at the end of the hallway. It was the vampire leader, his eyes burning with an unholy light. He smiled, revealing his razor-sharp fangs. "Welcome," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "I've been expecting you." With a roar, the vampires descended upon us. The battle was fierce and chaotic, the air filled with the sounds of snarls and screams. We fought with everything we had, our blessed weapons cutting through the vampires with surprising effectiveness. In the midst of the chaos, I saw Father Donovan locked in combat with the vampire leader. Their struggle was intense, each one fighting with a desperate fury. With a final, desperate effort, Father Donovan drove his stake into the vampire leader's heart. The vampire leader let out a blood-curdling scream, his body convulsing before disintegrating into ash. As he fell, the other vampires recoiled, their strength waning. We seized the moment, driving them back and finishing them off one by one. As the dust settled, a sense of relief washed over us. The nightmare was finally over. We had defeated the vampires, and we had survived. Father Donovan, though battered and bruised, smiled weakly. "It's done," he said, his voice filled with exhaustion. "They're gone." We made our way out of the mansion, the first light of dawn breaking on the horizon. We had faced unimaginable horrors, but we had triumphed. Danny clung to my side, his small hand in mine, as we walked back to the safe house. In the days that followed, the town began to heal. The police conducted thorough investigations, ensuring that no vampires remained. We were hailed as heroes, but the true victory was the knowledge that we had survived, that we had protected each other against the darkness. As life slowly returned to normal, I couldn't help but think of the others who had fallen. Their sacrifice had not been in vain. We had faced the night of the vampires and emerged victorious. And as long as we stood together, we knew we could face anything that came our way. The end.